Hi there, it's Mark, and welcome to my channel. You know, if you ever think that you have problems, read something like this. Recently, I started looking at books moving forward that I'd like to read. Very conscious of the fact that a lot of the choices that I make, they're not mainstream. And I'm surprised I got the amount of subscribers that I have. My choices aren't for everyone, and I know this one definitely won't be. I looked at lists that stated the best book by year from, say, 1946 onwards. I thought it'd be interesting to go and read the books that they recommend. So 1946, why then? Well, because the Second World War had ended and we're into, effectively, the postmodern era. The premise would be world literature, not necessarily from the British or the American stable. And this kept coming up. Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, who was an Austrian who survived Auschwitz. And he was famous in the 50s and 60s and beyond because he was a psychologist, and how he came to grips with his trauma of going through the camps. And I thought, okay, a bit grim, but it's on the list. And I thought, okay, I'll read that. And it is just, well, it's life-affirming, strangely. And as it says on the back by Simon Sinek, every human being should read this book. And that led me to ponder a couple of things. One, what type of books do I want to continue to read? Well, there's certainly the ones I am reading. Philosophy, ethics, because they talk about what it is to be a just person, especially with the ethics, and deep stuff, the imagination, the soul, the mind. Worthy books that have something to say. But also the fact that, again, it's very niche. Although 16 million copies have been sold of this book, that won't replicate outside of the book sphere. So what's it about? He gives 3 stages of somebody who, in his case, was imprisoned in a concentration camp. And psychologically, the things that he observed in people and came to write in 1946, that's the amazing thing about this. He wasn't liberated until 1945. He was seriously ill when he was. But by 1946, this book had been published. And of course, the Nuremberg trials had not happened. That would not have happened until later, 48, I think. And therefore, the world was only getting to grips just then with the horror that was coming to be known, and it had been known in official circles for quite a while, of the mass slaughter of people. And he said, well, how does that affect anybody? And although he's talking about a specific horrific event, this could be for anybody at any time in any era who goes through mass trauma. And he said there's 3 stages. There's shock, there's apathy, and then what he calls post-liberation. And the whole book is him charting that through in a very almost simplistic manner, easy to understand. Obviously it was translated. I'm assuming it was translated. There's 3 parts. His experience in the concentration camp. Part 2 in the postscript I haven't really looked into. It's his explanation of logotherapy, what he became famous for. So if I show you the size of the book, it's that big. You could read it in a day. Why do we live? Because he asked that question. If you don't have a reason to live, then potentially you're going to give up. And in fact, if you consider the themes of being fate, the meaning of suffering, the meaning of life, and the importance of the spiritual self, then that explains what he's trying to accomplish here. He's trying to say, when it came to the concentration camps, big, burly men and women didn't survive. If they didn't have something to look forward to, they tended to give up. If you were seriously ill, if you were old and infirm, by the time you got to one of the concentration camps, you were probably sent immediately to the gas chamber, especially in Auschwitz. They would line you up, and a gentleman there would point left or point right. No one knew what that was apart from the inmates who had been there for a while. And they don't say anything because of one of these reasons that he gives, apathy. And then people go left, directly to the gas ovens. If you got to the right, you basically were worked, potentially to death, or you managed to survive. Survival was really whether you had the ability to think internally and try and see good things in what was happening to you. And that is very important in this book. He was a doctor before the war, a psychologist. His father, mother, brother, and his wife died in camps or were sent to the gas ovens, so that excepting for his sister, his entire family perished in these camps. There's an amazing scene he talks about when he's in Auschwitz. And bear in mind that he is a scientist, and he does have this clinical scientific detachment about the subject. I've made a note of that for myself, which you could argue is a good thing. It's certainly something that was developed in him because of his discipline in civilian life. But he has this clear moment when he's working the roads in freezing cold weather that although he didn't know his wife had died, he would later, suddenly she was there with him in spirit. He said he could physically sense her. He even had conversations with her. Internally in his head, in his mind, because he couldn't speak out because the guards would have punished him. Of course, I taught the subject in schools in the UK as part of philosophy and ethics and history. So I'm aware of it. I visited Auschwitz, took a school trip there to Poland. Osheshim, went to Krakow. Wonderful country. Wonderful country. But of course, they're living with this horror even now. So when you go to Osheshim, which the Germans called Auschwitz, a lot of rail lines throughout Europe congregated there, and they could, at the railhead, build a camp. Of course, Osheshim is still a living village, town, and the locals would rather Auschwitz disappear. And there has been long debates there as to whether they should rebuild it, because it's collapsing. In fact, they had rebuilt one of the stable barracks where they were kept so that people can go and see. So you arrive there, you've got that very famous train line going through the entrance, the archways, and you can see how big the camp was. It was put into 4 sections. There was one called Canada. And you go there, and the boys, because it was a boys' school that I did the trip with, a lot of them got quite emotional. I got pictures of 1 or 2 of them kneeling down on the railway lines, and there happened to be, someone had put it there, a red rose. Just a very poignant scene. And it was a hot day in October when we was there. It was like 35-degree heat. It was unbelievable. We'd left England thinking it was going to be freezing cold. We all came out in inappropriately warm clothes. And it was scorching hot, not like back in Britain. You can see where the crematoria was, the steps. It had actually, someone said, why is it all rubble? Obviously, because it was destroyed. Somebody secreted in a lady in well, you can guess where she put the grenade, took it out, and then deliberately killed herself and everyone that was with her to destroy the crematoria. And this was towards the end when it was known that the Russians were going to liberate the camp. And further beyond, you got these little ponds. Very bizarre sense of energy there because bodies were buried there. And occasionally to this day, settlement bones will still come up. And the crematoria, you get to visit there and you see all these pictures of people. And you get to see where they were deloused. Bizarre looking things. So it's just a stultifying thing because you realise, although it's not as big as I thought it would be, that's because we're used to modern scale. Back then it was huge. And it was an industrial method to get rid of as many people of the Jewish nation and gypsies and communists and homosexuals as the Nazi authorities wanted to get rid of. And there's 3 camps. There was 3 camps. There was Morovich, which no longer exists. It's where They were doing chemicals, and the people who were kept there, interns, were marched there if they could every day to do work. And then there was Auschwitz, the old Polish barracks, which has got Arbeit macht frei on the top. Work will set you free. And these stone buildings and the original ovens, gas chamber, I should say. And you go through big, like, displays of, like, a glass window with stuff behind them, like suitcases and prosthetic legs and hair. And someone said, why is the hair all grey? And that's because it turned that colour when the person was gassed. But they cut it off. They cut the hair off afterwards because it was going to be used to stuff mattresses for sailors in U-boats or make jackets for the army. You can't believe it, that this was done. And he says here, what a human being does when he suddenly realises he has nothing to lose except his so ridiculously naked life. So when arrested, rounded up and put into the camps, there's this shock. And it must have been a terrible sinking feeling in the stomach. And he said, if there is a purpose in life at all, there must be a purpose in suffering and in dying. And by the way, I'm reading the preface here. Frankl is fond of quoting Nietzsche. And the quote is, he who has a why to live can bear with almost any how. And it's often, how can I live into that circumstances? Well, one law that any inmate in Auschwitz or in the camps were told strictly not to do is to prevent somebody committing suicide. And one of the easy ways out to do that was to walk into the barbed wire. So it's not a case of how do I live, because you could very easily have ended your life. It's why. Why live? And don't forget, some people were interned for years and managed to survive. There was a group of people who had it better than most, and they were called the capos. They were the sadists that were themselves rounded up and deemed to be unworthy of life, to be, eventually gassed or die. But they were given control over the people in the camp. And they got slightly better rations and slightly better conditions, and they just became the ruthless sadists to survive. The last of human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude in a given set of circumstances, to rise above outward fate. And that's what this book's all about. It's an amazing read. And he does say that his experiences that he writes here are his experiences. They're not necessarily what you would consider to be facts, because a lot of it he can't prove because it was in his head. And there were moments where he was so tired and exhausted that obviously the waking world disappeared into the half-awake world. He couldn't tell what was real. And he's very keen to ask himself at the very beginning of the book, how was everyday life in a concentration camp reflected in the mind of the average prisoner? And I think that was one of the reasons he managed to get through, because he knew he wanted to do it as part of his life work. There's videos of him in the 1950s, got this very clipped English accent, and he's talking about it, how to overcome the utmost lowest part of, human life. We who have come back, by the aid of many lucky chances or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know the best of us did not return. Interesting. He does talk about psychology requires a certain scientific detachment. But does a man who makes his observations while he himself is a prisoner possess the necessary detachment? Such detachment is granted to the outsider, but he is too far removed to make any statements of real value. Only the man inside knows. His judgments may not be objective. His evaluations may be out of proportion. This is inevitable. An attempt must be made to avoid any personal bias. And that is the real difficulty. There's been a lot of books written by historians of the Holocaust of people who were never in it, or in war, or had ever been in the forces, the military. You've got to be careful what they say. because they're outsiders. But also, those that survived, well, how impartial can they be? It's an amazing thing. It really puts into context a lot of non-fiction books. How accurate are they? Like I say, he talks about the 3 phases. The second one is the longest, the apathy. And the apathy really was to survive. They became so inured with people going off to the ovens. In fact, on his first evening in Auschwitz, it was pointed out to him, the chimney. Because I think someone asked of a load of people who had just arrived on a train. They'd been sorted, they'd been sent to various barracks, incredibly crowded. And someone said, "Oh, where's my friend so-and-so?" And he said, "Did he get left all right?" He said, "Left." And someone took him outside, and you see the smoke coming out the stack? There's your friend. And it took him a while to realise what he meant. They knew what was happening, but they became apathetic. What could they do? And in fact, one thing that is not mentioned here, and I was hoping it would be, or at least referenced to, apart from deliberately ending someone's life by going to the barbed wire fences, nothing's mentioned about rising up and fighting. It did at Sobibor, which was a very remote camp. But as far as I'm aware, apart from the woman who blew up the gas chamber, and how we know it is a woman, I don't know, nothing's really said much about those that, if they ever resisted and fought or decided that was en masse to rush the guards. Psychologically, there may be a reason for that. Apathy, the main symptom of the second phase, was a necessary mechanism of self-defense. All efforts and all emotions were centered on one task, preserving one's own life and that of the other fellow. So that was potentially it. If you're going to survive this, you've just got to carry on and hopefully not be noticed. And the apathy came to almost like a final point that he writes about. He said, "Man's destiny, which is different and unique for each individual. Everyone accepted that if you survive, you survive. If you don't, you don't." In fact, there's this great tale. I'm going to try and remember this one forever. Death in Tehran. Here it is. I'm just going to have to read this out. "A rich and mighty Persian once walked in his garden with one of his servants. The servant cried that he had just encountered death, who had threatened him. He begged his master to give him his fastest horse so that he could make haste and flee to Tehran, which he could reach that same evening. The master consented, and the servant galloped off on the horse. On returning to his house, the master himself met Death and questioned him, 'Why did you terrify and threaten my servant?' 'I did not threaten him. I only showed surprise in still finding him here when I planned to meet him tonight in Tehran,' said Death." You can't outrun fate. And that's what the general populace of the camp seemed to have accepted. Well, what will be then. God's will be done. And that's another thing. According to Frankl, religion and faith became very important to people. We're talking predominantly of Jews, not just Jews, predominantly Jews. And they would secretly hold as many readings from memory. They would have had rabbis there as well, as much as possible. They even had entertainment. Songs could be sung, which I think we've been given a slightly misleading account when it comes to films like Schindler's List, however fantastic that movie is. They did have laughter. And humour, however like wry and gallows humour, was there. And he talks about how important humour is to survive. When we're confronted by those hard moments in life, laugh. Tweak the nose of the spindly killerfish. And then there's this strange happening right at the end. They're liberated. He survived. But none of them could believe it. They'd imagined their release, their liberation for so long that when it came, they couldn't quite believe that they were not being duped. And it took a lot of will and effort and time to disappear. People were suspicious throughout. Is it like an April Fool's joke, or the equivalent as it is in Germany and so on? That's interesting. And I've always wondered afterwards when they got back into civilian life. And in fact, he said when he got back into civilian life, he never felt like he belonged there. This loss of place, this uprootedness pervaded him. There was bitterness and disillusionment when the person returned to his former life. When he heard the same phrases nearly everywhere, "We did not know about it, and we too have suffered," from civilian Germans, then he asked himself, "Have they really nothing better to say to me?" Disillusionment, that fate itself seemed so cruel. He had reached the absolute limit of all possible suffering, now found that suffering has no limits, and that he could still suffer even more outside of the camps. There were some men who found that no one awaited them. They'd all been destroyed. No one was there to greet them at a door. And that anger, why could they do this to us? How could this be done? Why is it afterwards people went, meh, oh well, move on. My wife's great uncle was in the Canadian forces. He was British. He'd moved to Canada just before the war. He'd helped set up Ward Air. He was a pilot. He was shot down and he was interred in Dachau for 9 months. Lost at least half of his body weight when he was liberated. He wasn't Jewish. He just happened to be the enemy pilot. So that itself was breaking the Geneva Conventions. He was so ill he couldn't leave Germany for years. He ended up marrying a German woman. Never spoke about it until just before he died in his late 90s. I only met him once. And supposedly, when he did start talking to his family members, he said something along the lines of what Frankl writes here. The crowning experience of all, for the homecoming man, is the wonderful feeling that after all he has suffered, there is nothing he need fear any more, except his God, if he had one. Just a couple of things to, really it's the psychologist coming through, that he only once had this desire to flee right towards the end of the war, when they were certain they may do it. But what happened in the camp, and this is, I think, something that I myself remind myself moving forward, if anything happens, the worst could happen and whatever. Or anybody's going through redundancy, and that's a lot happening at the moment. We had to teach the despairing men, and women, Reg, that it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life, and instead to think of ourselves as those who were being questioned by life, daily and hourly. Our answer must consist not in talk and meditation, but in right action and in right conduct. Almost Buddhist. In other words, virtue. If you go through something like that, become the virtuous person that the others had not been. And they knew as well about virtue, because there are times when he talks about, as it was obvious that they're going to be liberated, if the guards did hang around or were forced to confront the prisoners, suddenly they became nice for the first time, tried to help them, because they knew that they were going to suffer if they survived liberation. This is the soldiers now. But most of them deserted. I don't often agree with blurbs on the back, but I do agree with this one. One of the outstanding classics to emerge from the Holocaust, Man's Search for Meaning, is Viktor Frankl's story of his struggle for survival in Auschwitz and other Nazi concentration camps. Today, this remarkable tribute to hope offers us an avenue to finding greater meaning and purpose in our own lives. Highly recommended. Difficult if you don't know the subject and you're first confronting stuff. He doesn't fully go into the horror and the gore, but you would see that if you ever visit Auschwitz. And again, you could very easily get ghoulish and perhaps overemphasize the despair. Because what this book reminds us is that, yeah, that was there, but that's not what they wanted. They tried to be as humorous, and those that survived to adopt an attitude that would get them through it. Those that gave up are the ones who deficit theorized, saw no future. Also, and this is my final thing, part about this, and this is just me. This could very easily happen again. And it's very easy to slide out of democracy into tyranny. And this is the kind of book that could remind us where that may go, if we allow it. 1946. Definitely worth a read. Ta-ta for now.